Woman leaves her black husband for a white man 30 years. Her junior, unaware that her ex was a millionaire until $10 million came to light. The letter was folded in half, resting against the kitchen fruit bowl as if it were a grocery receipt. 3 lines. Calvin Diaz read it once. He read it again. Then he folded the paper carefully, ran his thumb along the fold as if smoothing something that could no longer be undone, and put it in his coat pocket. Diane had already left. He didn't hear the door. He didn't hear the car. He didn't know exactly what time she had left, because he'd fallen asleep on the living room couch after a call that lasted until 2 in the morning. Yet another technical detail his lawyers insisted on reviewing before the hearing the following month. When he woke up, the sun was high in the sky. Her coffee cup was in the sink, washed, and the large suitcase was no longer in the closet. He stood in the hallway for perhaps a full minute. Then he went to the kitchen, heated up the coffee left over from the night before, and sat down at the table. The letter said the following: that she loved him but could no longer live at that pace, that she needed someone who was there for her, that she had found that. She hoped he would understand. 3 lines for 22 years. Calvin finished his coffee, took the cup to the sink, turned on the faucet and washed it. He dried his hands on the dish towel she always left folded in 3 on the oven handle. He took his cell phone out of his pocket, stared at the screen for a few seconds, and dialed. The call lasted 2 minutes and 43 seconds. No one ever knew what he said on that call. Diane Carter was 51 years old and had spent much of her life believing that patience was a virtue for those who had no choice. She had a choice. She always had. And when Ethan Ross came into her life, 28 years old, with a broad smile and a disconcerting knack for saying exactly what she needed to hear, she decided that waiting any longer would be a waste. She met Ethan at a networking event that Calvin had refused to attend for the 3rd time in a row. "I have a meeting," he'd said, without looking up from the document on his screen, without asking if she was going alone. Without a word, Ethan asked her name before he even picked up a glass. Over the next 3 months, he called every morning. He texted before going to sleep. He showed up with flowers on a Tuesday for no reason. He was unlike anything she'd ever known. Unlike Calvin, who was quiet, methodical, and seemed to approach his own life with the same technical precision he used to solve engineering problems. She knew she was wrong. She knew it, and she went along with it anyway. What she didn't know, what no one around her knew, was what was hidden within Calvin's silence. What those late-night meetings really were. What that patent filed in 2003 at a law firm in Atlanta was really worth. She didn't want to know. That was the decision that changed everything. Calvin Diaz grew up in South Chicago, the son of an electrician who worked 6 days a week and came home with calloused hands and his dignity intact. His father had a phrase he repeated every Friday at the dinner table: "The world will tell you what you're worth. Never believe it." Calvin never believed it. He studied engineering on a scholarship, graduated in 3.5 years, and spent the following years solving problems that other people couldn't even see. He was the kind of professional companies called when something was wrong in a way no one could explain. Discreet, precise, invisible to those who weren't paying attention. Diane never paid attention. She saw the simple apartment, the ordinary car, the unbranded clothes, and concluded what was easiest to conclude: that Calvin was an average man leading an average life, that their future together would be more of the same. She was looking at him every day and saw nothing. Or rather, she saw exactly what he wanted them to see, because Calvin Diaz, on that day when he folded the letter and put it in his pocket, already knew something Diane couldn't have imagined. He'd known for at least 11 years, and he'd waited with the same patience his father showed when he came home every day, with calloused hands, without haste, without fanfare, without needing anyone to know. If you're following this story and want to know what Calvin was hiding, and why that 2-minute call is going to change everything. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Diane's new life began with a speed she mistook for freedom. Within 3 weeks, she had moved into Ethan's apartment, a spacious place in downtown Charlotte with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view that seemed designed to be photographed. And Ethan photographed everything. Breakfast, the view, the two of them together in the bathroom, mirror. Diane quickly learned to tilt her face to the right because he said it looked better that way. She thought it was cute at first. Then she thought it was normal. Then she stopped thinking about it. They traveled to Miami in the first month, to Nashville in the second. Ethan had boundless energy. New plans every week, invitations, parties, lunches with people whose names Diane couldn't remember. It was like living in a rhythm that never slowed down, and she ran to keep up without asking where exactly they were going. Calvin never took her anywhere. That's what she told her friends. What she didn't say was that Calvin had proposed 2 trips the previous year, one to Japan, another to Portugal, and that she had turned them both down because the timing wasn't right, because work was hectic, because there was always a reason that seemed reasonable at the time, and that she now preferred not to remember. It was one night in Nashville, after a dinner that cost more than she earned in a week, that Ethan asked the first strange question. They were on the hotel balcony, drinks in hand, the city sparkling below. Ethan was quiet, which was unusual. And then, without looking at her, he asked, "Does Calvin still work in systems engineering?" Diane turned to him. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged. "Curiosity. You said he was an engineer. I didn't say much about him." "You said enough." Ethan smiled, took a sip, changed the subject. Diane kept the question in her head for maybe 10 minutes. Then the mood shifted. He made a joke. She laughed, and the subject died there. But it wasn't the last time he asked about Calvin. In the weeks that followed, the questions would pop up at random moments, after breakfast, during a walk, in the middle of a conversation about something completely different, always in passing, always with that casual tone that seemed too rehearsed to be truly casual. He wanted to know where Calvin worked, with which companies, if he had partners, if he still lived in the same apartment. Diane answered what she knew, which wasn't much, and watched Ethan process every detail with an attention that seemed disproportionate for someone who claimed to be merely curious. A 28-year-old man doesn't take that kind of interest in his girlfriend's ex without a reason. Diane knew that. But it was easier not to pull on that thread. Meanwhile, Calvin Diaz continued with the same routine Diane had called mediocre. He woke up at 6. Black coffee, no sugar. He left at 7:30 wearing the same beige coat he'd been wearing for 4 years. He worked until 7 at night, sometimes later, in an office on the 18th floor of a building in downtown Atlanta that Diane had visited only once, stayed for 15 minutes, and described to a friend as completely characterless. What she didn't see or didn't want to see were the stacks of documents on the conference table at the end of the hallway, the letterhead of a firm specializing in intellectual property, the licensing agreements, the emails from 3 different companies, all in the telecommunications sector, all negotiating access to a technology that Calvin had developed on his own in a rented room when he was 32 and had enough money for 2 more months' rent. The patent was registered in his name. It always had been. What it produced, its true value, no one really knew. Not even Calvin's colleagues, not even the few friends he had. Only the lawyers knew. And they had a confidentiality agreement that Calvin had insisted on including from day one. He was silent by choice, and silence sometimes is the most precious form of patience there is. Diane didn't think about Calvin often, but when she did, it was always with that mix of guilt and justification that people fabricate when they need to believe they made the right decision. She told herself she had done what was necessary, that she deserved better, that anyone in her place would have done the same. Maybe that was true. But there's a difference between doing what's necessary and doing it for the wrong reason. And Diane, deep down, knew exactly which of the two she had done. Ethan came home from the gym with a smoothie in hand, kissed her forehead, and asked if she wanted to eat out or order delivery. She said, out. He smiled that smile she still found beautiful, and which, at times when the light hit it from a different angle, looked like a very well-fitting mask. She didn't tell anyone that. There's a specific moment Calvin kept to himself for years without telling anyone. It was a Wednesday in September of 2014. Diane had gone out to dinner with colleagues, and he was at home when he received an email from the law firm. It was short, 2 sentences. It said that the initial phase of the case had moved forward, that the outlook was favorable, and that he should expect further updates by the end of the quarter. Calvin read the email 3 times. Then he went to the window, looked down at the street below, people passing by, cars, the normal life of a weeknight, and stood there for half an hour, doing nothing, without calling anyone, without celebrating. When Diane arrived at 11 o'clock at night, smelling of the restaurant's perfume and with her lipstick slightly smudged by wine, he was on the couch watching a documentary about bridge building. She tossed her purse onto the chair, said she was tired, and went to the bedroom. He didn't say anything about the email. Not that night. Not ever. The story of the patent begins in 2003, but it really begins in 1998. Calvin was 27 when he realized there was a structural problem in the way certain data compression systems communicated over high-frequency networks. It wasn't an obvious problem. It was the kind that appears at the limits when speed exceeds a certain threshold and the system begins to lose coherence in fractions of a second that no one could measure accurately. He spent 5 years working on it in his spare time, weekends, holidays, nights after Diane went to sleep. By 2003, he had a solution, compact, elegant, and one that solved the problem in a way that more experienced engineers hadn't considered because they were working from different premises. He filed the patent with the help of a lawyer who charged a low fee and who would later say that it had been the most underrated deal of his entire career. The world didn't pay immediate attention. It rarely does. Over the following years, Calvin licensed parts of the technology to small companies, modest sums, discrete contracts, while waiting for the industry to mature enough to understand what he had on his hands. It was a game of patience, and he had patience to spare. The problem arose in 2013. A mid-sized telecommunications company based in Dallas began using a variation of his technology without a license. It wasn't a direct copy. It was clever enough to look different at first glance, but identical where it mattered. Calvin noticed. His lawyer noticed. And instead of making a fuss, instead of issuing any kind of public statement, Calvin filed a lawsuit in total silence. 11 years of litigation, 11 years of hearings, appeals, counterproposals, settlements rejected because the terms weren't fair, and Calvin saying no with the same calmness with which he said anything else. Diane stood by him for much of that process without knowing it existed. She saw the late nights, the calls he received and took into the hallway. The trips to Atlanta he described as routine technical reviews, and at no point did she ask with enough depth to receive a truthful answer, not because Calvin was dishonest, but because she had decided, at some point she herself couldn't pinpoint, that Calvin was predictable, that there were no surprises, that life with him would always be that apartment, that car, that black coffee, without sugar. The most costly decision she ever made wasn't to leave. It was to stop paying attention before she left. There's a scene that Diane's friends would recount later, after everything came to light. It was at a Sunday lunch 2 years before the breakup. Calvin had been invited but declined. The same meeting, the same office, the same excuse. Diane showed up alone, had one too many glasses, and spent part of the afternoon saying she felt invisible beside him, that he never really saw her, that she had ceased to exist within that relationship. Her friends listened. They agreed. They said she deserved better. None of them asked if she really saw him too. That question remained unanswered for many years. What no one around Diane realized, and what she herself would take time to admit, was that there were two kinds of invisibility in that story. Hers, which was real and hurt, and his, which was calculated and protected, something the world wasn't ready to see yet. The difference between the two is that one of them was a choice, and the other was a consequence. The weekend when everything started to fall apart was a Friday in March. Ethan said he was going to visit a friend in Raleigh. 2 days. He'd be back Sunday night. Diane stayed home, did her nails, watched a series he never had the patience to watch with her, and enjoyed the silence in a way she wouldn't admit to anyone. He came back Sunday night as promised. Everything was normal. The trouble started the following Tuesday when Diane was looking up a contact on Ethan's cell phone. He'd asked her to find the number of a restaurant that was in his address book, and came across a name that shouldn't have been there. Patricia Howe. Diane recognized that name. Patricia Howe was a lawyer, an intellectual property specialist, with an office in Atlanta. And it was the name Calvin had mentioned just once, at a dinner years ago in passing, as the person who handled his technical matters. Diane stared at that name for a time she later couldn't calculate. She carefully placed Ethan's phone back on the table. She picked up hers. She opened the browser. She searched for Patricia Howe's firm. The website was understated, not much detail, but there was a section on notable cases, no names for confidentiality reasons, and one of them described an 11-year intellectual property dispute in the telecommunications sector that had settled for $10 million. $10 million. Diane browser. She opened it again. She read it again. She spent the night hoping there was a simple explanation, that Patricia was an acquaintance of Ethan's family, that the name was a coincidence, that she was putting together a puzzle with the wrong pieces. When Ethan came home from work, she didn't ask anything right away. She watched. She watched the poured himself a glass of water, the way he tossed his keys on the counter, the way he checked his phone before putting it in his pocket. A quick, almost imperceptible gesture. She finally asked with a lightness she didn't feel, "Do you know a lawyer named Patricia Howe?" Ethan didn't change his expression, but there was a pause, half a second, maybe less, before he said no. She saw the pause. "Are you sure?" "I am." He opened the fridge. "Why?" Diane said she'd seen the name somewhere and found it familiar. She let the subject drop there, went to the bedroom, and lay in the dark for an hour, thinking of one thing only. Ethan knew who Calvin was before he met her. It wasn't hard to piece together once she decided to really pay attention. The networking event where they met had been organized by a technology industry association, the same industry where Calvin had been operating for decades. Ethan had a vague profile on professional networks with sparse connections that, upon closer inspection, converged on people close to Atlanta's legal and financial circles. He had never explained exactly what he did. Consulting, he'd say without specifics. And she had never pressed him because the details didn't seem important when he was smiling at her like that. The theory Diane had pieced together on her own, without telling anyone, was as follows. Ethan knew about the lawsuit. He knew there was money waiting at the end. And he had calculated that the person with the most access, the most information, and the most influence over Calvin at a moment of vulnerability was her. The woman who had lived with him for over 2 decades. She had been used as a point of entry, and the part that stuck in her throat when she tried to swallow that thought was that it had worked. Not the way Ethan planned, because Calvin hadn't fallen apart, hadn't sought out Diane, hadn't done any of the things a broken man usually does. But it had worked in another way. She had walked away on her own and left Calvin exactly where he needed to be. The deal was closed in April. $12,200,000. A single transfer. No appeal, no recourse, nothing else to wait for. Calvin received the news on a Monday morning over the phone. While he was parking his car in the same parking lot as always, Patricia gave him the figure. He said thank you. He hung up. He sat in the car for a few minutes with the engine still running. Then he turned off the engine and went to work. The news didn't make it into any newspapers. Calvin didn't want it. Patricia had made it clear that there were options, that a case like that had press value, that law firms would use the precedent for other disputes, that gaining visibility could be strategic for future negotiations. Calvin listened to everything carefully and politely said no to everything. He didn't need visibility. He never had. What he did with the money, no one knew right away. They were decisions made in stages, over the course of weeks, with the same precision with which he had built everything he had. A portion was invested, another was allocated to long-term funds, and a specific portion, $2 million, was earmarked for the creation of a foundation bearing his father's name, Harold Diaz Foundation. The goal was straightforward: to offer engineering scholarships to young black people in South Chicago. There was no opening ceremony. There was no speech. There was a website with an application form and a contact email address. Calvin had written the text for the homepage himself one Saturday afternoon with a cup of coffee by his side, and had left it as it was in the first draft because it sounded exactly the way he wanted, straightforward, without needing to explain what he was doing or why. His father would have thought it was right. Diane found out through LinkedIn. A mutual connection had shared an article from a local Atlanta publication about the foundation. Small, unremarkable, the kind of story that sits at the bottom of the local business section. But the name was there. And there was a photo of Calvin at the headquarters, with his back to the camera, looking at a wall where his father's name was affixed in metal letters. She read the article 3 times. Then she stood there, phone in hand, feeling something that took her a while to name. It wasn't regret in the conventional sense. It was closer to that feeling of realizing, with considerable delay, that you were looking at a door and thinking it was locked when it was just ajar. She had chosen not to push it open. And now the door was on the other side of the hallway, in a house that was no longer hers. She wrote him a message that night. She spent an hour writing and deleting. She tried to be direct, then thought it was too cold. She tried to be warm, and then it sounded fake. Finally, she sent something short. She said she'd read about the foundation, that she'd been happy for the recognition he deserved, and that she hoped he was doing well. She reread it before sending. She sent it. Calvin replied the next day at 7:20 a.m., which meant he had read it before leaving for work. The message contained one sentence: "I always have." Diane stared at those 2 words for a long time. There was no anger in them. There was no irony meant to hurt. There was none of the things she had prepared herself to receive. No accusations, no display of pain meant to make an impact. No trace of what she had left behind. It was just a fact, stated with the same calmness with which Calvin said everything. "I've always been here." She placed her phone on the nightstand, looked up at the ceiling of the room, the bedroom in Ethan's apartment, with the large window she'd found beautiful at first, and had a thought she couldn't shake. She had spent 22 years with a man who never had to prove anything to anyone, who built what he built in silence because he believed in what he was doing, not because he depended on external validation to keep going, who lost a woman and didn't use that as a reason to stop. And she had chosen instead a man who had calculated her worth before even asking her name, Calvin Diaz didn't speak to Diane again after that message. Not because he was holding back something that needed to be held back. He didn't seem like the kind of person who operates that way. But because there was nothing left to say, his life went on. The foundation was growing slowly, in the right way. The first cohort of scholarship recipients had been selected, and Calvin had read each application personally one Sunday afternoon with coffee by his side. There was one specific candidate, a 16-year-old boy from Englewood, the son of an electrician, who had written in his introductory essay that he wanted to be an engineer because his father had taught him that the world would tell him what he was worth and that he should never believe it. Calvin read that sentence, and he was silent for a long time. Then he drew a red circle around the applicant's name and wrote beside it, in small, precise handwriting, "Approved." Some stories don't end with a bang. They end with a red circle on a sheet of paper on a Sunday afternoon while the coffee grows cold beside it, and with the quiet certainty that what was built in silence can never be taken away. If this story touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel. There's much more waiting for you here.